Good afternoon, evening, or night, depending on when you watch this video. I am joined today by S.A. McCarthy. Amongst many other things, he is my brother, a Catholic husband and father, and he is well known for being a writer at the Washington Stand, a contributing editor at the American Spectator. He contributes to Crisis Magazine and to Real Clear Politics, in addition to quite a few other publications and reputable places where you can get news and opinion pieces. Very well connected and well known in the Catholic news world, and so we're very happy to have him on today. Sam, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me on the show, Jacob. I appreciate it.
So we're here today to talk as you know, and as anyone who clicked on this video knows, to discuss the upcoming conclave, the Papabile, which are the most likely and the ones who are eligible to be elected Pope out of the College of Cardinals, and exactly how we should go into this. So first, who was thinking Pope Francis would pass on Easter Monday? That was kind of a shock.
It was, I think, a blessing in a way. Everybody's been very active on social media, and a lot of my friends, a lot of people that I follow are all pointing out, it's really a blessing that he got to live to see one more Easter, and that he did pass away within the octave of Easter. I think that there's meaning, significance to that. I think it's moving to reflect on. So God bless him for that.
Absolutely. A beautiful gift it was to pass, especially after an Easter Sunday. So he still got to have all the full sacred Easter Triduum once again. So in about, I believe it's scheduled for May 7th is the beginning of the conclave.
Yeah.
Which the process of is the able to vote cardinals assemble and vote for a new pope, correct?
Yeah, so there's the rule is that cardinals under the age of 80 are eligible to vote, which means that there's, I think, 135 cardinal electors. There's at least 2 who have confirmed that they won't be able to participate in the conclave. Just there's situations in their own parishes, countries, dioceses, etc., that are going to, and with their own age and health, that are going to preclude them from traveling and participating in the conclave. So that means that there's effectively roughly 133 cardinal electors. There's a lot more members of the College of Cardinals who currently are participating in the general congregations. They're having these meetings, giving speeches, delivering homilies, praying, reflecting, in order to prepare for actually entering into the conclave. And cardinals over the age of 80 are permitted to participate in that process. There's some of them who are over the age of 80 who their voices are going to be prominent and to some degree influential. But May 7th, they're going to go into the Sistine Chapel. They're going to be sequestered away and deliberate, debate, and vote over who they're going to name the next Roman pontiff. And, obviously, famously, they have black smoke coming out from the chimney while they're deliberating. And once they've selected pontiff who's accepted, requires a 2/3 majority vote of the cardinal electors. The smoke turns white, and it's declared we have a new pope.
Habemus Papam. So, you're American, I'm American. I think probably 99.9% of people who ever watch this video are going to be American. It's probably very easy to say, oh, this is just a Catholic election. Should we view it like that? Is that applicable? Should we have that outlook on a conclave and on the church politics?
Well, there's a couple issues with that. One is, as you point out, we tend to bring kind of an American political perspective to various matters, whether it's, watching films and television or friendships, even relationships with family members. We tend to bring that American political perspective to bear. And in some cases, that's, perfectly fine. There's not much of an issue with that, I don't think. In this particular case, though, we're dealing with something that it's not a presidential election. It's not a race for a Senate seat or, something of that sort. This is also not, strictly speaking, this is not a democracy. The Catholic Church is a hierarchy as opposed to a democracy. So it's not like we all get to vote. I mean,
Right.
we can say things, and some of us who are in, positions where, uh, like myself, for example, people read my work, and so I
Hmm.
can share some of my thoughts that I have. Doesn't mean they're going to have any relevance or influence. Um, we don't particularly get a say in this process. It's up to the cardinal electors. And you can't really fit this process into the kind of traditional American left right, liberal conservative spectrum. There are multiple planes, and they're not always a spectrum,
Hmm.
in the Catholic Church. There's, matters of, we typically tend to look at things as kind of traditional versus progressive, orthodox
Hmm.
versus heterodox, which kind of falls a little more in line with kind of that American political dichotomy, with heterodox being, kind of leaning more towards questioning, challenging the standard age old teachings of the Catholic Church, especially on matters of morals, um, and orthodoxy obviously being adhering to that. And with matters of tradition and progressivism, typically we apply that to matters like the liturgy,
Hmm.
or certain social issues. So, for example, when it comes to the issue of abortion, a more traditional view would be recognizing this, as Pope Francis pointed out throughout his papacy, that this is the preeminent moral issue that we, the laity, the faithful, typically have to contend with, as opposed to a more progressive view might be, the proposed seamless garment theory, saying that there are other social matters that, are kind of on a par with it, such as,
Hmm.
poverty, homelessness, etc., which are, of course, issues that we need to address as Catholics, and we do have a role and, frankly, a moral responsibility to engage with and address these issues, but they're not on the same level of moral gravity as, abortion,
Right.
according to the teachings of the Catholic Church. So we have this tendency, I think, to kind of try to fit something like the papal election um, into an American political electoral framework that just doesn't fit, because there's so many other issues that you're going to have to deal with that have no relevance or correspondence to the American political framework, the standard political framework. You also have these areas that it really has nothing to do with, a spectrum. It's not, left, right. If you're one or the other, there's maybe, 35 different positions that could be espoused on a particular subject. And it's just a matter not so much of which one's absolute right and absolute wrong. They're not necessarily all opposed to each other. They can all cooperate with each other.
Hmm.
So trying to kind of fit things into that framework, ultimately, it's disappointing on some level, but it also certainly runs the risk, I think, of really being divisive. When you view these things as, a matter of left, right, which are, diametrically opposed to one another, when they're really not left, right, it runs the
Hmm.
risk of, somebody who maybe espouses this position that you see as whatever, more right or more left than the other, kind of alienating yourself from that person or setting yourself up in a false and unnecessary position of opposition to that individual, whether it's a priest or a bishop or a cardinal or a pope. So I think that trying to fit the moral, theological, liturgical, etc., politics, so to speak, of the Catholic Church into that framework, I think that that's ultimately it's misleading,
Hmm.
at best, and divisive at worst. It also risks making politics into your God, worshiping politics as an idol, which as Catholics in particular, we should always strive to make sure that our politics, our political actions and viewpoints are subservient to the moral, social teachings of the Holy Catholic Church.
Right. We're Catholic first, and then we're whatever party or ideology we ascribe to, but that has to be secondary to our identity as Catholics. So
Yes.
yeah. So obviously there are the 22 Papabile. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Are they? They're not the only people who can be elected pope, though. We could elect any bishop, I think, as well. Correct?
So technically, you can elect any adult baptized male Catholic as the Pope. That's extraordinarily unlikely to occur. Typically, the cardinals elect one of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And especially right now, I think that that's pretty much what we can expect as a cardinal. One of the things with the cardinals, of course, is, typically they're elevated to the College of Cardinals on the basis of some particular experience or, area of expertise, that they've demonstrated over the course of their clerical careers. And they also serve the College of Cardinals. One of the key aspects is that they serve as sort of advisors to the Pope. Some of them in a very official capacity. So, for example, Cardinal Pietro Parolin is the Vatican Secretary of State. He would be a close advisor to the late Pontiff, Pope Francis, on matters relating to foreign diplomacy, relating to foreign nations, trying to broker deals and accords and ceasefires, between warring or conflicting nations. That would be his area of expertise. You also have, if you look at, we had at least twice during the Francis pontificate, we had a group of cardinals issue what's called dubia, which is Latin for doubts, effectively asking the pontiff to clarify particular things that he said in documents that he's published. We had this with Amoris Laetitia and with Fiducia Supplicans. The cardinals asked for clarification just in order to ensure that, a misunderstanding of something that the Pope said does not result in somebody thinking that something sinful is acceptable, So just asking for clarification. And they've pointed out Cardinal Raymond Burke, for example, was one of those cardinals who participated in both sets of dubia. And when he was questioned about it, again, that kind of American political framework kind of comes into play. It's kind of framed as, oh, you're challenging the Pope. Oh, well, you're, opposing him. And Cardinal Burke points out, I'm really not. He said, I don't view it as I'm challenging or opposing him. I view it as I'm, one of his advisors. I'm part of the College of Cardinals. That's one of my responsibilities. I'm asking him as our spiritual father for further guidance, further direction, So typically the Cardinals will elect one of their own, and I think we can probably expect that they're going to elect one of their own this time around. I think it's highly unlikely that they're going to elect someone who's not part of the College of Cardinals.
Yeah. So Bishop Barron isn't getting anything white soon, huh?
I mean, we'll see. I'm not a gambling man, but I wouldn't place a bet on that.
So currently, there are resources for people who don't know who the Papabile are, and if they want to learn more about them. I think you sent me some of them before we started this. College of Cardinals report.com, I think. Is that an official thing, or is that just made by anyone in the church, or is that simply just...
I'm going to be perfectly honest. I don't 100% know. I don't think that it is. I think that it's essentially a group of Catholics who got together and did some very thorough research on various statements that have been made, the actual history, biographical history of the different cardinals. And it's not just the Papabile who are in there. They expand and look at some of the other cardinals as well, some of those who are going to be participating and voting in the conclave, some of those who are too old to actually vote in the conclave, but who are going to be, participating in the preparations for the conclave. It's a pretty decent resource, I think. And in addition to just kind of glossing the history and the various positions held on different issues by a number of these cardinals, they also kind of try to analyze, and they've selected a number of them who they consider Papabile, who they think are, based on the outside and based on what's known at present, who are considered kind of most likely individuals to be named the pontiff.
Okay. Yeah, I'll link this in the description below, so if anyone else wants to do some study on their own, that'll be there. According to these people's report, then, and their thoughts, there are 22 papabile, those people who are most likely to be elected. Now, looking towards some more familiar names first, there is Cardinal Burke and also Cardinal Seurat. These are sort of more well known, especially when in the American world, when you think politically, as being more traditional. They're more orthodox and traditional, and they've sort of made a name for themselves doing that. Starting with Burke, do you think there's a chance at all of an American pope?
I mean, there's, I suppose, a chance. I do think that I'm very hesitant to actually say I think that this person stands the best chance. I can see scenarios where particular individuals, the outcome that that individual is named pope appears more likely in different scenarios, but really one thing that I think we as Catholics have to bear in mind, right? And especially as, again, American Catholics kind of having that kind of very left-right dichotomous binary political ideology or framework, I think that we also have to bear in mind that we don't necessarily think the way that the Cardinals think. The Cardinals are going to have different priorities than the average American Catholic is going to have. In some cases, the Cardinals are going to have different positions on different things than, say, the average American Catholic. They're going to have different considerations because they have different responsibilities. The Pope carries the weight of the Catholic Church on his shoulders. You and I don't. The people listening to this, unless the future Pope is listening to this, which I will place a bet there, I think that's unlikely, but if the future Pope is listening to this, unless the future Pope is listening to this, we don't carry the weight of the Catholic Church on our shoulders. We have responsibilities, and those are typically within our sphere of influence,
Yep.
So for most of us, that's going to be our family, friends, maybe coworkers, our parish community. It's not going to be the entire global Catholic Church. Whereas the Cardinals all have to some extent, carry or share that responsibility, especially in this interregnum period before electing a new pope. They have to kind of share shouldering that responsibility. So they're going to be paying attention to things like, what does the Catholic Church as a whole need in a father? What's necessary? And you and I don't necessarily know that. We're not necessarily going to think the same way. We may not necessarily even agree with some of the conclusions that at least some of the cardinals reach. So I do think that someone like Burke, there is, I'd say, an outside chance that someone like Burke might be named pontiff. But again, I'm not quite in a position where I'm going to place bets on individuals yet.
Of course.
Maybe kind of so to speak, a genre of cardinal, but not an individual specific cardinal.
Okay. Well, then let's shift to the genres. Then, what are your thoughts on the we spoke earlier about traditional, progressive, orthodox, heterodox. How exactly what concoction do you think is most likely to hopefully someone who's overly heterodox doesn't get elected? And those are just my thoughts, not anyone else's, but I personally wouldn't really want someone who's overly challenging of church tradition and authority to be named successor of the apostles.
It'd be tough, given that one of the pontiff's responsibilities is to safeguard and hand on church teaching and church authority. So be kind of undermining his own position, even if the next pope were to openly blatantly challenge or dismiss long-standing Catholic Church teaching. I do think that just based on things that the cardinals have said in some cases in interviews with news outlets, there's one, I think I sent you the link to this, a New York Times article where they interviewed a number of cardinals, mostly those who would be considered kind of part of the more progressive wing of the College of Cardinals. But just based on things that cardinals have said in news interviews and in some of the general congregations, and knowing what I do about some of the cardinals and where they stand on various issues, I think that what we're most likely to see is, I won't say like a compromise candidate, but I do think that what we're most likely to see is the cardinals choosing as the successor of St. Peter one of their own who is kind of seen as one of the big calls right now is for unity in the church. Pope Francis did a lot of good, but I don't think that there's a lot of contention that he was also at times somewhat divisive with some of his off-the-cuff remarks. I'm not talking about any of his magisterium here, but some of his off-the-cuff remarks, his handling of certain administrative positions, it was seen, certainly by American Catholics, but also by some in Europe, even in Africa, Asia, seen as at times a little bit divisive. And so there is, I think, that unity within the Catholic Church needs to be preserved. We can't risk, some people like Cardinal Ludwig Gerhard Müller from Germany, who used to lead the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the Vatican's doctrine office. It's since been renamed to the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. But Cardinal Müller said that he thinks that if a progressive, heterodox-leaning cardinal is named the next pope, that might run the risk of schism, that you're going to have, a lot of those who lean more towards tradition and orthodoxy are just going to essentially reject the pope, which is actual schism.
Right.
And that would be, I think, disastrous. Sorry, repeat. What was your original question?
Just more. You said you'd be more willing to comment on the type of person to be elected instead of specific people.
Yeah. So I think, given the concern about church unity, which is something that cardinals are talking about a lot in the general congregations, given the concern for church unity, and also the fact that we have a lot of different things that we're going to need to balance, right? There's certain issues that seem, again, to us as American Catholics, seem huge right now, right? Like responding to gender ideology. And of course, that is a huge moral concern. But it's not something that the global church is dealing with. In a lot of parts of Asia and Africa, for example, that's not an issue. Transgenderism, same-sex unions and stuff, that's not something that they really have to grapple with because it's not a prevalent social issue there. So, I think that we're going to wind up with somebody who, again, I won't say is a compromise candidate, but somebody who is definitely not on the same page as Pope Francis. You can even look at some of those who've been considered like allies or close associates of Pope Francis, someone like the current Camerlengo, Cardinal Kevin Farrell. He's, considered a little more on the progressive side. He's been a close friend of Pope Francis for a while. Very first thing that he did after Pope Francis died was he busted out some of the old, very fancy vestments from storage, stuff that, I'm not kidding you, had been locked away for 12 years since Benedict XVI resigned from the chair of St. Peter back in 2013. He went and found these old vestments and put them on. This, I won't say a rejection or repudiation, but clearly, this recognition that, what, maybe all of the, getting rid of all of the trappings of the church that we've held, and revered for ages, centuries at least, maybe that's not always appropriate. Maybe there's a time and a place for these things. Certainly there's a time and a place for some form of austerity and a physical connotation of humility. But, there's also a time and a place for these things. There is a time and a place for the regal trappings of the church, because it's frankly honoring God, rather than man, when it's properly understood anyway. So I think that there's kind of an emerging consensus amongst the cardinals that it might be best to have somebody who, can certainly respect the legacy of Pope Francis, but somebody who's not going to continue implementing or promoting or even just not acknowledging progressive policies. Somebody who is going to foster church unity and try to heal some of the divisions that there are. For example, a lot of traditionalist Catholics have felt very much sidelined by Pope Francis, very much ignored, and it might be a matter of, kind of the prodigal son story and the son who didn't leave his dad, and saying, hey, wait a minute, what about me? But it is also, I think, a valid concern. I myself attend the Tridentine Mass frequently. That's the old form of the Mass celebrated. Pope Benedict XVI referred to it as the extraordinary form of the Mass, celebrated prior to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. So I definitely have sympathy for that area, that feeling kind of ignored or sidelined, by comments that Pope Francis would make about, traditionalist Catholics being too rigid, being unfeeling, things like that. And his restrictions of the celebration of the Tridentine Mass, especially removing it from parish churches. I understand why he did that. I'm not, for clarification, saying, oh my gosh, he should not have. I'm just saying, I understand, but I also understand why a lot of Catholics who are devoted to that form of the Mass, felt very much kind of like they were being restricted or sidelined, felt very dismissed by the man who, they call Holy Father, So I think that we're going to see somebody emerge who focuses on that church unity, and somebody who skews more towards orthodoxy, traditionalism, and on a political scale, probably something along the lines of conservatism. I'm thinking particularly of the issue of immigration, which is emerging not just in the West, as are issues like gender ideology, but across the whole globe. That's something that, and the words of the pontiff, they do have, a say in this. He does have influence in this sphere. You can look at right now in the States, for example, our vice president is a Catholic. He converted to Catholicism. Immigration is definitely one of the issues that he might have to talk about with the Pope, and the Pope's words and comments and teachings, if he goes that far on that subject, are going to have an impact, again, not just in America, but across the globe. So I think we're going to see somebody emerge who skews towards orthodoxy, traditionalism, and political conservatism, but without necessarily being, kind of, again, to borrow a phrase from our American political lexicon, far right. We're not going to see I don't know if your viewers are familiar with, and I'm not recommending the show because there's some objectionable content, but it's an HBO show called The Young Pope, and they have Law plays the first American Pope who takes the name of Pius XIII, and he is the term far right would definitely be applicable to him. So I don't think that we're going to end up with that. I do think we're going to end up with somebody who, again, just borrowing from our political lexicon for the sake of ease, somebody who's more moderate, but skews more towards, like I said, orthodoxy, traditionalism, is not opposed to it, maybe doesn't, celebrate the Tridentine Mass all the time, like someone like Cardinal Burke does, but somebody who isn't opposed to it, doesn't want to restrict that, I think another thing that has to be looked at that's often overlooked, especially by American Catholics with our kind of overly political mindset at times, one thing that is going to have to be looked at and addressed is the actual administrative side of things. The late Cardinal George Pell from Australia, shortly before passing away, issued a memo to the College of Cardinals where he talked about the Francis pontificate and some of the things that the next pope is going to have to effectively fix from the Francis pontificate. One of those things was the rule of law. Pope Francis really consolidated power and authority within his own self, instead of adjudicating or entrusting responsibilities and tasks to administrators and advisors, etc. He earned, in some circles, the nickname of the dictator pope because of that. For example, Cardinal Pell pointed out that Francis would, as Pell put it, rule by motu proprio. Motu proprio is basically means by his own will or by his own volition. It's kind of like the papal equivalent of an executive order,
Yeah.
For those who are more familiar with American politics than Catholic politics. But it's really just a document that the Pope issues that he's basically saying, this is the way things are going to be, this is the way things are going to be run, simply because I say so. They're typically on the shorter side from, say, like a papal bull, or it's certainly something like an encyclical or an apostolic exhortation, typically relatively short. And the chief justification is do this because the Pope says do this, So I think that's one concern that's also going to have to be addressed. So I do think that we're probably going to wind up with somebody who has experience in the administrative realm. So some of these guys who their chief area of experience is in, say, teaching, right? In teaching theology, teaching at seminaries, or whose only administrative experience is in parishes and dioceses. We're probably not going to see someone with that kind of background. That's my anticipation. We are going to see someone who has a little bit of that. Someone who certainly has run dioceses, run parishes, has served time as a parish priest, but has moved on to curial positions within the Vatican, and has that, I don't want to say diplomatic, but has that sort of political capacity, that capacity to manage things on a much larger scale, that capacity to interact with, engage with, compromise with, and get along with other departments and divisions, other congregations and dicasteries. I think we're going to see someone along those lines emerge. That's just my general anticipation. It could be completely incorrect. We will see.
We'll find out.
That's my anticipation based on how the general congregations are proceeding.
Okay. One of the, at least in my experience, my opinion, I was in seminary when a lot of the motu proprios sort of rolled out, and so there was a lot of confusion regarding how to perceive Pope Francis. Again, I think you used the word perceived as divisive, and I think that's probably one of the things, because it was really difficult to figure out where he stood, especially viewing it as American Catholics. He'd do one thing, we're like, oh, that's a more, left-leaning thing. They do something else, you're like, oh, that's like definitely a right-leaning thing. We can't predict you. We have no idea what you're going to do next. And I think, sadly, a lot of people, I'm sure you experienced this, I experienced this, would view Pope Francis, and meet people who viewed Pope Francis, saying like, oh, well, sort of how we would view a president, like, oh, well, he's not my president. He's not my Pope. I'm waiting for the next one. I don't really accept him. And so, based on this and yours and I's work in the church, and obviously we've met many people, I'm sure, with views akin to that, what should the best response be, in your opinion, to whoever is elected next to the papacy as Catholics?
I think really the one thing that I think, there's a couple issues with language barriers sometimes. And I think that especially for us in the English-speaking world, it's helpful to remember that the term Pope really is Papa, Father, who we are obligated, as basically required as Catholics, on a formal scale, uh, to respect the Pope as our father. I did not always agree with or appreciate everything that Pope Francis said or did. Um, I've not really tried to make that a secret per se, but I have always been very careful to treat him with respect, to refer to him respectfully, and certainly when he's exercising his papal authority, I've at least tried to refrain from criticism, and from open contradiction, uh, because his authority is so much greater than mine, you know. Um, and so no matter what reasoning I may or may not have, he is my father, or was. Um, and so I think that that's probably the best approach.
Mm.
I think it's also worth bearing in mind that you have sort of, I think, two. So you really have two ways of leaving the church, if you think about it, while still calling yourself a Catholic, right? Because I mean, there's apostasy, right? You can just say, I don't believe in the church, I don't believe in God, I don't, and leave entirely. But while still calling yourself a Catholic or a Christian, there's kind of two ways to leave the church. One is schism, which is violating the laws of the church, kind of adhering to the what the church says in matters of theology and doctrine, etc., but not following the governing rules of the church. And then there's heresy, which is you might follow the governing rules of the church, maybe, I don't know, but not accepting or openly rejecting aspects of doctrine or theological truth, Um, and I think that each one kind of lends itself to a different kind of sin. Both, I think, are a sort of pride. It can be involved in both. I think that especially for a lot of Catholics who are very traditionalist, very orthodox, and one of the issues with this, I'll just say this as well, is also that there has been a over the past many decades, and it looks like in certain areas in particular that this is being fixed, this issue, that priests have become aware of this, probably because they suffered through this same issue themselves growing up, and are working to remedy it. But there has been a dilution of catechesis, of actually
Mm.
teaching the Catholic faith. And so a lot of dioceses, parishes, etc., they're now working to repair that. Um, and so, especially for a lot of Catholics who are more traditionalist, who are more orthodox, I think that there is, speaking as one of those more traditionalist Orthodox Catholics myself, there is a risk, I think, especially since we've mostly had to teach ourselves these things. We didn't go to, Sunday school and get lessons on these things. We had, our Sunday school teacher talking about this parable or that parable. And well, how does that relate to your life? Well, how is this relevant to you?
Being nice more than most other things.
An overt focus on niceness and that idea of inclusivity without really having something to include people in is really, because there's not a problem with including people, but you have
Right.
to have something to include them in, And I think that dilution of catechesis and the resulting a lot of those who are more traditionalist and orthodox having to kind of mine for this, dig for this, and discover it on their own, it lends itself to the risk of a certain brand of pride,
Mm.
and you can see examples of this with, I'll cite just, I don't want to, be calling people out or whatever, but just one example, because it's prominent and relatively recent, is that of Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano,
Mm.
or Vigano. He was papal nuncio, so he was basically the Vatican's ambassador to the U.S. for many years. He worked in the Vatican Bank and worked on financial reforms. He did a lot of good work in the church, but last year he was excommunicated, and it's because he reached this point where he effectively said, I know the Catholic Church better than the Pope. and I'm taking care of the Catholic Church better than the Pope. Therefore, I'm not going to respect or listen to the Pope. Which is, I mean, if you think of the Pope the way that he is, right, as Papa, Father, right,
Mm-hmm.
you don't just say, if you have an issue with how your dad is handling something in your family, you can talk to him about it. You can bring that concern to him. You can even just try, to just say, all right, look, I'm just going to, kind of go along to get along, whatever, But you can't suddenly say, you're not the dad anymore, I'm the dad. No, you're not. You didn't raise your siblings, you didn't procreate your siblings, they're not of you,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't work that way, and so that's, I think, viewing the Pope as we say, the Holy Father, and in moments of difficulty, I certainly experienced moments of difficulty with Pope Francis and with, really struggling to see him as a father. My latest piece in Crisis Magazine is on that theme,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly with how easy it was to see Pope Benedict XVI as my father,
Mm-hmm.
and how difficult it was to see Pope Francis as father. But in those times, in those moments, I think it's best to really devote yourself to prayer, to say, all right, well, you know what, I'm going to pray for every rosary that I've prayed for the past 12 years, or nearly 12 years. I've made sure to pray for the good intentions of the Holy Father, and for his good, for his health. So I think that really treating him like your dad in some respect, not in an informal context. I'm not saying
Right.
that, because, there is a heightened degree of majesty to the papacy, but treating him as your dad in terms of respect and affection, I think that that's a helpful way. So regardless of who we get from this next conclave, whether we get, somebody who's ultra progressive on morals and theology, somebody who's heterodox and, says stuff that most of us find, utterly insane, or whether we wind up with somebody who's, maybe orthodox and traditionalist to a fault, and is says things that others might find utterly insane, no matter who we wind up with, or someone kind of more in the middle, on a lot of these issues, no matter who we wind up with, we should accept this person as my father, accept this person
Mm-hmm.
as family. You may not always get along with or appreciate everything that people in your family do, but you're going to love them, because they're your family. You have to view the Pope as, my father, I think that's the best way to go about doing it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I think my last words on the matter before we wrap up is Peter was the first pope, and I think from our humanistic view, me specifically, I would have chosen John, the beloved disciple, the one who was so close that even Peter went to John to say, "Hey, can you ask him this?" So I think also part of it will be like, hey, like maybe even like objectively, if you will, the best suited, in our opinion, as from our human view, for the job will probably not be, more often than not, elected to the papacy, to this, just because he doesn't fit into what we would ideally choose, doesn't mean he's not still the Pope, and also doesn't mean that he isn't the person who should have been chosen. Because even Peter, you can sort of infer from Scripture, is kind of confused, especially near the end of the Gospel of John, when he looks around and sees John, says, "Well, what about him though? Like yes, you just for the third time solidified my papacy, but what about him? What about this man?" There was something good in the other, and I think one, if again very unlikely, the next pope is listening to this, one, say hi, please. But two, to pull those people into the circle. And for us as the laity, as for us as the faithful, who have to, for better or worse, adhere to this new papacy, to say, no, the church will not end. The church cannot end. And even if it's not who I might think is most suited for the role, it's who the College of Cardinals, those who, through the divine authority of God, have been entrusted with this power and this responsibility, it's who they elevated. And so just like you were saying, I will respect that elevation and that decision with this type of filial devotion, even if it's not what I would always like.
Yeah. I think if I can just add to that point, I think another thing to bear in mind also is that Christ assured us, that the gates of hell will not prevail against my church, against the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church will remain undefeated. No matter who's Pope, you could have the most insane person as Pope, and God is going to, even if he didn't pick that person, right? Because I think that's another misconception we sometimes have about the papal conclaves is whoever comes out as Pope, God picked that person. God has allowed that person. The Holy Ghost provides guidance to the cardinals while they're in the conclave. It's up to them, though, just like it's up to us whenever we're offered grace or guidance. It's up to them to accept that or to reject it, to ignore it, to act on it, So we may not always wind up with the person who we picked, who God picked, but whoever emerges from that has been allowed to emerge from that by God. And God is going to bring some good from that at the very least. He is also going to prevent whoever that is, by the very nature of the office of Pope, he's going to prevent whoever that is from doing something that will utterly destroy the church. It might be painful. It might be difficult. Like I said, I certainly had my moments of pain and difficulty over the past 12 years. As I noted many other Catholics, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who've left the Catholic faith and pointed to Pope Francis and what he said or what he's done. Sometimes misunderstanding what he said or what he's done, sometimes not misunderstanding it, but just saying, you know what, I'm going to choose my view over, whatever he says. I'm going to reject my father because I don't like something he said or did,
Right.
And I think that really maintaining our faith, our Catholic faith, is trusting that Christ was telling the truth. That when Christ said, the gates of hell will not prevail against the Catholic Church, that he was telling the truth. If we reject it, if we say, oh, because of this Pope, because of this man, because of his leadership, the Catholic Church has completely failed, so is all of Christianity. So is God. That means that Christ was a liar, that he was not all-knowing, all-powerful, and that he lied. So really, it's a matter of a fundamental and crucial matter of faith, And so especially when, maybe the dad analogy just isn't cutting it for you, focus on that, focus on Christ, trusting in Christ. And he told me the truth. I believe that no matter how difficult this gets, because certainly it looked difficult for the apostles as well. When you had all of the temple guards show up and arrest Christ, when everybody fled, Christ was alone. He was beaten, scourged, mocked, marched to his death, and then crucified in the most gruesome form of execution known at the time. Probably seemed, dark, but they ultimately trusted in him, and said, all right, I'm going to believe. We need to do the same, no matter how brutal things get. And it might get to a point where, we are down to 12 Catholics again. Who knows? Let's hope and pray that we have many Catholics and many people who, are working on getting to heaven. But no matter how dark things get, we need to just trust in Christ and believe that when he said the gates of hell will not prevail, he was not, guessing. He was speaking an eternal truth.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Sam. It was good to see you. Good to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And at the time of recording of this, we are 1 week away from the beginning of the conclave. I don't know when this will be released, but please do, anyone watching, do pray for the conclave. Do pray for the Holy Ghost to guide the decision of these men entrusted with this most sacred and weighty duty. And pray for the next pope. The first place the pope goes after being elected is called the Room of Tears, to basically lament his loss of who he was and now who he's called to be. Pius X referred to himself as the prisoner of the Vatican, so it's not exactly as we might view it the most cushy job. And so do please pray for the next pontiff and his strength and his fidelity to this role and to this office. Cheers.